Hi there, my name's Jaimie Li, and I will be teaching an 8-week creative nonfiction workshop at Hugo House this May and June. I teach creative nonfiction because I write creative nonfiction, so today I am offering a prompt that I hope gets you inspired to write a little more personally. And I'm going to preface this by saying that what I like to do when I give prompts to students is tell them in advance of giving the prompt that sharing what you write is voluntary. Because I think that if we are prompted and then spend 15-20 minutes writing, in a focused way, drawing what we've observed, what we've felt, what we imagine, everything from ourselves, drawing from that material and directing it in the service of that question that was the prompt. If we do that believing in the back of our minds that we might be called on to share our work or anything like that, to speak it publicly, to post it publicly, that will change the way we write. Inadvertently, it becomes more performative. It becomes more about comforting or connecting with or communicating with other people rather than, as I try to encourage, comforting, connecting with, and communicating with ourselves. So today I want you to write as if no one is watching, and we can go from there. So the topic of the prompt is called the Crucible, and I got this idea from a friend of mine who was studying in her MBA program. There was a mentor who had the students in her class break out into groups of 5 and really think about the most difficult moment in their life that shaped them. Now, this is really a question of what was the trial by fire. The focus was on not something that was happening right now, a crisis that was happening now, but rather a crisis that had already passed. And so I am contributing this prompt especially during this time because I hope it gives us a little distance from the things that we cannot control at the moment. Unfortunately, not being able to change our environment on our own terms is universally challenging, so we can write towards how challenges have shaped us for the better when there's the distance of time. Memoir writers will know this. There has to be enough time that has passed that, one is not in the fire, so to speak, and can therefore derive power from writing about that difficult experience from, a place of remove and safety and reflection. So today, the question is, what is your crucible? So what is your trial by fire that made you who you are? Now this can be a very, big, grand, legendary, mythological thing. It could be a catastrophe. It could even be, a trophy, a success that you achieved that, created so much expectation that in itself became its own kind of burden. It could be positive, it could be negative, it could be personal or professional, but just some moment where you experienced a challenge that essentially felt like it was impossible to navigate. Those moments where when we ask ourselves, well, what do I do next? Is there a right thing to do? How can I take direction? I think those moments are really educational because when no one else can give you the answer, we must look within ourselves. And that, even before we put pen to the page, is what shapes our writing. I think a lot of this investigation might take a few passes to really get further down into what a certain life experience meant for ourselves, and that's why I really encourage you right now to write like nobody is watching, because it at least gives you privacy, you know. And I think it was Dani Shapiro had an interview where she said, people often think memoir is, like exhibitionism, like being totally unguarded and almost naked in front of an audience, when it's anything but, really. Constructing a memoir project is building a story out of life experience brick by brick. And Dani Shapiro called it an edifice, like your memoir and your story and the way you tell it publicly is, not really transparent wall, it's an edifice. And so, especially important for these rough drafts, for these prompts, for these little snippets that we write, however they may come. Some of us can journal and write by hand and, really dedicate ourselves meditatively to the act of writing. Other times, I myself will do a grocery run and then have a thought, and before I start my car, when I get back to my car and the grocery bags are in the back, I email myself like a paragraph of writing. If, something has occurred to me with urgency, I feel like, I had an emotion just now or am in an emotion now that reminds me exactly of an event that happened in my past. These are these magical, personal, like, kind of just absolutely wonderful connections that we can make between who we are now and where we've been. So when I talk about the Crucible, this prompt is like something that you could write now if you feel like the question I've just asked really brings the thought into your mind at this minute, and you think, oh, I've always wanted to talk about this big moment that I knew that I was becoming. I knew that I was becoming the person that I was supposed to be, that I am now, that I still am working towards becoming, and other people, it might just be something where you write a few ideas down and you reflect on it. You give yourself a little time to think. It's a big question. Sometimes it might take, sort of a gestation period in your, like, subconscious, for a day or a couple days or a week. And that is absolutely as much a part of writing as is, putting down a paragraph or 500 words on command. So really, when it comes to personal writing, especially memoir writing, it is almost like an additional muscle that we develop for self-reflection, for observation of what we're feeling as we go about our present days, and observation of how we're feeling when we start thinking about the past. And it looks very different. It looks very different for all of us. So I think another question for the prompt that I like to go into is, what is something that you're proud of yourself for doing, even if you would admit that to nobody else? A big part of writing personally is never comparing yourself to anyone else. That's very difficult, and it only sort of really works if we put a buffer between ourselves and the collective conversation, because we all need support and intimacy and validation. But sometimes when we look into ourselves and we find the truth of how we felt in a moment, or what type of self-esteem we derived from an experience, it can be something that we might discount or evade when we share publicly, saying, oh, well, it was no big deal, or, well, it wasn't like this, big achievement of someone else's, or it wasn't as devastating as what happened to him. Those things are all disowning your own experience. So when we are faced with our own thoughts and commit to immortalizing them on our own page, the purpose of which we don't know yet. You know, that could be something that you want to use in the story that you're working on. It could be something that sits in a drawer for a couple of years. It could be something that, you know, you just want to get off your chest and then have a ritual to dispose of. Whatever that might be for you, the only really way to shift it and to look at it and to use it and to draw meaning from it and to draw strength and resilience from it is to be as honest as you can about it. So there are certainly scenes that I've had to write a dozen times, you know, in order to get down to the honesty of it, you know, because the first cut tends to be what I think other people will understand, you know, like this relationship felt like this, because doesn't it feel that way for everyone? Well, maybe, but that's not the truth of what it felt like for me, so I always have to kind of like tune out my expectations of what I think are normal and expected. So when we talk about the Crucible, the trial by fire, and talking about it as a positive thing that gives us strength, really think about what were you proud of yourself for doing or learning or feeling or responding to in that moment. Big or small, just try to make it as value neutral as you can. There are moments where sometimes the things that I'm proud of in difficult moments can be as simple as not crying or even crying. You know, whatever the challenge was, it's tied to me, it's tied to the situation around me, the expectation around me, and what seems like the most logical and courageous response for me might not seem that way to somebody else, but that is how I start telling my story. That is how I start explaining these are the rules of my world, you know? And so you can really take, you know, both yourself as the writer going back into your memories and eventually over time the reader by the hand, you know, and walk them through this emotional journey. Because essentially that's what a story is, you know, especially a memoir. It is an emotional journey. And it can be difficult to access this, you know, we're kind of caught in a lot of uncertainty. And so it's especially helpful to look towards the past and say, what impacted and shaped me personally the most? Another note on, you know, being able to write more vulnerably if you're just writing for yourself right now is my friend who was in the MBA class and that gave me the idea for this prompt. She mentioned that for some people, it seemed like when it came time for them to share their crucibles with each other, that really they had a deeper, more meaningful one, but it wasn't something they were willing to share. And so they kind of pitched another one that was a little less, you know, dangerous or scary to share with somebody else. And that is definitely the limitation that we can impose upon ourselves unconsciously, subconsciously, when we think that we know we'll have to, like, perform this work as we write it. You know, share the thought as it occurs to us, share the feeling as it occurs to us. There's a lot of sense of isolation right now, I think, from people as we're all sheltering in place or we can't have our normal routines. But the purpose of writing can really transform that into a sort of comforting solitude. One example that I will be working on for the next few months is a family project that I'm working on that also informs my memoir. Essentially, I live up here in Washington and my parents are in California, and I call them every week and I've started just interviewing them, you know, kind of asking them about stories that I remember them telling me when I was a kid growing up that we haven't talked about in decades. And this conversation that's kind of centered around questions and listening and, not imposing the meaning that I think should be there, but rather just, sifting through my feelings as new information from my parents comes in, has been really freeing, I would say. It's really allowed me to take in quite a lot more of our family story than I was able to even just a year ago, because I was so attached to the interpretation that I had put on things that had happened through my parents' immigration, through changing economic circumstances, through loss, just quite, all of the events that make up a life. And when I was prepared to release that and put a little distance, release the expectation and put a little distance between me and the truth of the story, by essentially, saying, well, I don't need to share with my parents what I think happened. I only need to ask them what happened. And then any other reflection I can hold back and have on paper with myself. It's proved a much more fruitful way of interviewing, and, as kind of a perk, it has been really making my family feel a little more connected and like we're still getting quality time together, even though we, canceled a few plans to see each other. So there are all sorts of ways that being able to hold a dialogue with ourselves can enrich this time of sort of being forced to be alone. And I think I mentioned before, the practice of honesty is a discipline, so when you do ask yourself, what was your trial by fire? Or what were you most proud of doing in that moment, in the wake of the moment? It definitely is a question that's worth posing, a prompt worth pursuing every so often, every couple of weeks, every few months. And you never know, like eventually your drafts and your notes and however you get your words on the page start to dig towards more of what you really want to say for yourself. And I think that is the pursuit of truth, as much as we can understand it in a moment. That is the sense of accomplishment, I suppose. I'll think of a better word for that. So this kind of goes into my last prompt question. What did you discover about what you need? In that moment, in the crucible of great achievement, of great loss, of great victory, of great disappointment, whatever it might have been, what did you discover about what you need? And I think oftentimes during big life moments, the thing that is happening externally, what we're given, is actually not what we need. And what we need is something far more personal, intimate, small, incidental, unexpected, and that weird little quirk that we understand about ourselves is really just the gift that writing gives us, to be able to immortalize, to record exactly how things were, rather than what other people seem to tell us, how it goes or what it should be. So I hope that prompt gives you a lot to think about. I hope it gives you, a little bit of reflection, even a little bit of comfort to know that the things that we have walked through in the past teach us about ourselves, and it teaches us about what we need, about how we feel, about ways that we can give ourselves credit for what we've done and what we've survived or achieved. And in that way, really help us envision how things might be going forward. So I hope you enjoyed that and got something from it. And stay well. Happy writing.